Alright, here we go. This is the Estes Olympus. I'm getting ready to fly it on a D12-3. And it goes straight up. So the parachute was a little bit slow to fully open up, but we ended up getting the rocket to stand up nonetheless. And the rocket's in perfect shape, no damage at all. Alright, next up was the baby Bertha on a C6-5.
Baby Bertha's almost down. And down she is.
Estes Goblin on a D16-4 Q-Jet.
Wow, what a fantastic flight. That was awesome.
Estes Wizard A83. Nike X C12-4 Q-Jet. So I probably had too big of an angle on it, but still turned out okay. Hi-Flier on a B-64. Citation Patriot on a C-63. Epic II flying on a B-60 staging to an A-83.
3, 2, 1, go. Go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now that we've watched all of these awesome rocket launches, we need to discuss what we learned from them. What were some of the flight characteristics, and what will we do differently next time when we launch these rockets? Alright, so the first launch in the video was the Estes Olympus taking off on a D-12-3 for its first flight. Here we go, here's the rocket right here. And the launch was just great. The D-12-3 was the perfect motor for it. Here's a D-12-3 right here. And the reason it was a perfect motor was because the D-12-3 has a very high thrust spike at the very, very beginning of the burn. So it accelerates the rocket very, very quickly off of the launch pad, which is good for rockets that are kind of big for a D motor, such as the Olympus. And then if you look at the thrust curve of the motor, the thrust tapers off very, very abruptly after that initial spike. So what happens is the rocket takes off very, very quickly off of the pad, and then it slows down almost immediately as the thrust tapers off. And like I said, for a first flight, this is perfect because the rocket takes off safely in case the rocket has kind of marginal stability. The higher thrust in the beginning helps the rocket take off safely, which the Olympus does not because it has huge fins. But anyways, it takes off really, really quick, and then it slows down almost immediately. So what happens is it doesn't go very high. And since it's not very high, you can actually watch all of ejection. It stays within your line of sight the whole flight, and make sure everything's operating well with the ejection system. Now, unfortunately, on this flight, the parachute took a really long time to kind of unravel itself. You know, it originally looked like, at least to me, that the parachute had opened when the rocket ejected. But kind of as it started getting closer and closer to the ground, you could kind of see that it looked like it was a little bit tangled up still. I'd say probably about 100 feet above the ground, the parachute did finally open. And it all worked out for the best because, hey, the rocket stood up on landing, as you saw in the video. And that's, what better way to land your rocket because it makes it easy to find, right? But I do always want to emphasize, be so careful with these parachutes because sometimes they are just very, very hard to get to open. Just use a lot of that talcum powder on them and make sure you're rolling them up very, very carefully as you put them inside your rocket. I also wanted to note, if you're interested in seeing how I mounted this D12-3 in the rocket, make sure you check out the build tutorial for the Estes Cherokee E that I made, because it shows how I like to mount my motors in my rockets. I normally, for 24mm motors and up, I don't like to use those metal motor hooks because they're basically restrict the length of the motor you can put in the rocket, and there are motors that are longer than the D12-3 that I might like to fly in the rocket. So anyways, if you want to see how I like to tape, motors such as this one inside the rocket, make sure you check out that Estes Cherokee E tutorial video. Alright, so now that I've flown the Olympus once, I want to fly it a whole lot more times. And my next flights are probably going to be on reloads for this. This is the 24/40 Aerotech reloadable motor system. And I would recommend almost every reload you can put in this for the Olympus. I am not going to try to fly the Olympus on the D9 White Lightning. I think it's going to be too slow. It's going to be scary. I don't think it's going to get high enough to safely deploy. I probably will also not fly it on the E11 Blackjack for the same reason. But I do have some F12 reloads. I might try an F12 in it. I also have some D15s. The D15 is very similar to the D12-3, except for that it's a composite Blue Thunder propellant. But the performance is very, very similar in that it has a very high peak thrust. Also, if you've never assembled a 24/40 Aerotech reload, make sure you check out my tutorial video on how to assemble the motor. I basically go step by step on the assembly of an F12-3 Blackjack. And it's also got a really cool picture of the Star Orbiter launching at the end. So if you've never done one before, make sure you check out that video. It's got a few of the tips and tricks that you need to make sure you have a good, successful launch of your first reload. Alright, let's go over this baby Bertha rocket. Here it is right here in all of its glory. So the baby Bertha is a shorter version of an Estes classic called the Big Bertha, which I guess you would call its bigger sister. And the baby Bertha in and of itself has gained a whole lot of popularity in recent years. You see it all over the place at a bunch of different rocket launches. A lot of people love it. It's always in stock at Hobby Lobby, so at some point in your rocketry career, you're going to run across the baby Bertha. So the launch that we saw in the video there was on a C65. Now, I don't always recommend flying the baby Bertha on a C65, and that's because the rocket has an extremely low center of pressure, and for that reason, it likes to kind of fly directly into the wind. And so a lot of times, the trajectory of the rocket is more horizontal than you'd like. And when you have a lot of wind and you're flying on a small field, that's not always a good thing. However, I will also say that with those big fins, after the streamer ejects, the rocket, tends to float back pretty quickly from where it came from, although not always back as far. So for the launch that we saw in the video, the wind was very, very calm, and so the rocket flew pretty close to vertical. What you saw in that video is probably what you can expect from the baby Bertha if you fly it basically in zero wind, and you saw that it still took off at a pretty decent slant. So for that reason, unless you're flying on a big field, I would fly the baby Bertha on a B62 motor because it has a shorter burn, and that'll ensure that you get it back. However, if you like the excitement and the very long burn time of the C65, it is a really, really cool motor. And if you're looking for something exciting, maybe a rocket that doesn't just always fly straight up, then throw the C65 in your baby Bertha. It'll be fine. It just tends to go kind of far away into the wind. Now this next rocket is one of my favorites, the Estes Goblin. In fact, this rocket is slowly becoming my favorite rocket that Estes makes because it is a phenomenal design. Did I say it's a phenomenal design? Let's look at why this rocket is so great. It's got, first of all, it's got a 24 millimeter motor mount, which is super cool for a small rocket. You don't normally see small rockets with 24 millimeter motor mounts, so you put really big motors in it. And then when you fly it on the really big motors, it flies very, very straight because it's got these really, really big fins and it's got a really, really heavy nose cone. And because Estes supplies a lot of clay to put in the nose cone. So the rocket flies straight as an arrow. It's a fantastic rocket. I highly recommend it. If you don't have it already and you fly rockets, you need to get one. Basically, almost all experienced rocketeers have an Estes Goblin in their collection or have flown one. So ironically, after talking about how cool it was that the Goblin had a 24 millimeter motor mount in it, the launch that you saw in the video was actually on an 18 millimeter motor, and that was the D16-4 Q-Jet made by Quest. And the motor is super cool. The motor is loud. It's got excellent black smoke. You can see it on the way up. It's the perfect motor for the Goblin. The only thing you need to do is to make sure you use the Estes, let me try to bring it up here, 24 to 18 millimeter motor adapter. This will allow you to fit the motor in your rocket. I don't recommend shimming the Q-Jet motor up with a lot of tape to get it inside of the rocket because that tape will add really too much weight to the rocket. If you don't add more weight to the nose cone, at that point it's not going to be flying high enough anyways. So basically what I'm trying to say is don't just shim up the motor to fit it in the rocket. That basically will not result in a good flight potentially. And I do recommend getting this 24 to 18 millimeter motor adapter because it's very, very lightweight and it should not adversely affect the performance of your rocket. I also want to note that I did use a parachute for recovery on this flight. On the previous flight, I used a streamer. It was a crepe paper streamer with tape on it, and I broke a fin, and so that's the reason I chose to use a parachute on this flight. And hey, the parachute worked out well. If I was going to fly the rocket to a much higher altitude, I probably would go back to the streamer and risk breaking the fin, so I would make sure that I got the rocket back. You know, it's kind of interesting that this rocket has a streamer to start with instead of a parachute. I mean, and this is just speculation. My thought is that, you know, it's a high performance rocket and it's also a small rocket, so you would think that it would have a streamer. But the truth actually is that the rocket's actually pretty heavy and it's pretty dense and it has really, really big fins that are easy to break on landing. So the parachute is not unreasonable, you know, and if you're flying it on a D or even a C, if you try to fly it on a C, which I'm not sure I recommend, but if you're not flying on an E or an F, I mean, maybe if you're just flying it on an E, I would still use a parachute. I probably wouldn't go to a streamer until it's flying on an F because the fins are really big. The rocket, although it's small, it's very, very heavy. So, you know, it can get damaged pretty easily on landing. So, you know, unless you're doing an F motor in it, I would probably stick with the parachute. All right, now it's time to go over the Estes Wizard, which is probably my favorite minimum diameter 18 millimeter minimum diameter rocket that Estes makes because it flies super straight. It has excellent stability and it basically works every time. And so for the flight in the video, I used an A83, and that's because, you know, unless I have a whole lot of people out there with me to help me find the rocket, or I'm flying on a field with extremely short grass, there's really no sense in flying it on anything more than an A83 because the A83 still gets it high enough such that it's a good launch, and it just goes so high on the C67 that basically it's very, very hard to see, and you have to have a very, very clear day and basically the perfect launch conditions to do it. So what you saw there in the video was the flight on the A83. It still takes off super fast, and it's a great rocket to fly on the A83. And also be sure to check out my build tutorial on this rocket. The build tutorial is actually me building the actual rocket you see in that video. Alright, the next launch in the video was the Nike X, which you can see right here, which is a very cool looking rocket. It's got, let's see, it's got 12 fins on it, which is pretty unusual. It's pretty cool. Like I said, it's a great looking rocket. The flight that we saw in the video was on a C12-4 Q-jet, and it was an awesome motor. I mean, for a C motor, the sound, it was almost like a shrieking sound. Like it was like pierced, it was a piercing kind of shrieking sound. It was super fast. It was a super cool motor. The Nike X just leapt off the pad, very quickly. The only issue with the actual flight itself was that the rocket kind of veered off to the side, kind of at an angle. Now, I did have the rocket angled when I launched it, so it was not pointing straight up to begin with, but it almost seemed like it took on, even more of an angle than I expected it to. So I'm not really sure why it did that, but, it happens. The last time I flew this rocket, I flew it on a C65 and I aimed it straight up and it flew straight up. Again, I don't really know that that's related to the motor. I just think that's the turn that the rocket decided to take on that flight. The other thing I wanted to note was that I did use a streamer for recovery, and this is the second time I've used a streamer for recovery in this 12-fin rocket, and I haven't broken one of the fins yet, so I'm going to keep using the streamer. So yeah, I wouldn't use a parachute in this rocket because you don't have to, and like I always say, if you fly your rocket with a streamer, it will land closer to the launch pad and you have a better chance of getting it back. Alright, so the next launch in the video was the Estes Hi-Flier. And it flew on a B64 motor. And, this rocket lives up to its name. It flies high. On the B64 motor, I actually temporarily lost sight of the rocket. And to lose sight of a rocket on a B motor on a relatively clear day, or at least at the time that I launched it, it was clear. I was not up against clouds and a low ceiling, and I still lost sight of it. So the Hi-Flier on a B64 goes pretty darn high. Okay, this next rocket is an absolute classic. It's the Estes Citation Patriot. Here it is. Okay, hopefully that'll stay. Now, this is a classic rocket, but the first thing I'm going to point out right out of the gate is that it has an 18mm motor mount. And this is a little bit frustrating. There's only one motor that, in my opinion, that this rocket can safely fly on, or at least one Estes motor, and that is the C63, which does turn in a really great flight. It's slow, it's majestic, and it's beautiful. However, if you want to fly higher or have a more exciting flight, then basically you're a little bit out of luck because it only has an 18mm motor mount. So, if you're fine with just flying the C63 on this rocket and you only want the slow takeoffs, then that's fine. But it really could be used as a more versatile rocket than that. For example, I would love to fly my Citation Patriot on an E11 Blackjack. I still think it would be relatively slow, and with those giant fins, it would fly very, very straight and beautifully on the E11 Blackjack. So, maybe next time we can build a Citation Patriot with a 24mm motor mount and test it out and see how it goes. All right, the last rocket that I want to go over is the Epic II, which we can see right here. Should we get a good look at it? And in the video, we saw it launch on a B60 staging to an A83. And the launch was great. The staging went perfectly. The only issue, though, was that the streamer did not fully come out of the rocket. And, the rocket was so light that it didn't really matter from a damage perspective. It definitely came down way too fast, but basically the rocket was pretty much unscathed except for a little bit of damage on the forward end of the body tube. But what I want to talk about is why that happened. And there's really two reasons. One primary reason, and that primary reason is that A83 in the sustainer, I did not have it tight enough in the rocket. There was not enough friction between the motor and the body tube. I did put tape around the motor when I put it in, and I thought that I had the fit right, but I did not. It was still too loose. I messed up. This is a very difficult balance with this rocket because you have to have the motor in tight enough so that it does not eject when the ejection charge goes off. But you also have to have it loose enough so that you can actually get it out of the rocket after you launch it and not break it. The problem that you have when the motor ejects, other than the fact that it could fall and land on something or somebody, which would be bad because it's hard to see coming down, is that when the motor ejects out of the rocket and doesn't stay in it, there's energy lost in going towards ejecting the motor that would not be otherwise. So there's not as much energy to eject the streamer fully out if the motor ejects out the back of the rocket. And that's what happened here, and that's the primary reason that the streamer did not fully come out. The secondary reason, I would say, is because the streamer is actually really big for this size of tube. You have to really kind of jam it in there, and it's really pretty tight. And so for my next launch of the Epic II, I might cut down on the streamer. I might make it a little bit smaller so that it has an easier time coming out. And I'll try to get a little bit tighter fit on that A83 and the sustainer. The other thing that I wanted to note about this launch was that it didn't actually go as high as I thought it would. I flew it in some pretty extreme cloud cover that I think was pretty low, but I was able to keep the rocket in sight the entire launch. So I was a little bit concerned that with the B60 to an A83, it still might go super high, but it didn't. So I would recommend that motor combination as a first flight. It will work well, no problem.